David Goodhart, welcome to Thinking Class. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, likewise. I think both of us enjoy a good chat about all things that we're interested in, and I'm delighted that you've joined me. I think became aware of you at the beginning of the lockdowns in 2020, or at least that's when I had started to read your work. I'd certainly read some of the articles which you shot into the public consciousness with, for instance, the Too Diverse article from 2004 in Prospect magazine, which I think we'll talk about. But what I read was at a pretty pivotal moment for me as well. So in lockdown, I ended up back in Northumberland, which is the place that I'm from. I've been living all over the place when I left home at 19. It wasn't the usual model of going off to university and getting a liberal arts degree and jumping on a graduate program. It was a bunch of retail and sales jobs for about 7 years, trying to climb the greasy pole best I could, jumping around the great cities of the north, Newcastle, Manchester, Leeds, ended up in London. I'd been in financial services. Lockdown hit, and I thought, I don't really fancy staying in London for lockdown. I'll go back to Northumberland, but it was never in the plan. And I'd always tried to avoid going back home. But when I got back home, I really enjoyed it. And there are a bunch of reasons why I enjoyed it. And I think part of it was this sense of feeling rooted to somewhere again, that I started to feel like I was attached to the place and the people. I got to know the history. I was seeing some of my old school friends again. And I realized in that moment that I'd been living as this rootless atom who'd been bouncing around all these different cities, trying to grasp onto career things. And I guess I had tried to train myself in that mindset of being a global citizen. But I wasn't highly liberal or on trend with the social change. And when I came across your book of drawing a distinction between the anywheres, who roughly fit that latter view I just talked about, that I kind of forced myself into, and the somewheres, I realized I was somewhere in between. And actually there was that there were virtues to being a somewhere person and that they were disregarded. And lots of your work is built on that. You've talked about how lots of somewhere people might work with their hands or be in caring professions, and they're typically not afforded the same status in society, whereas a lot of the anywheres, the global citizens who are highly liberal, they're part of the laptop class, they can move around, they have this sense of achieved status rather than an ascribed status. And it all just was talking to me, and I thought, wow, he has really nailed it, and it does explain a lot of the political movements going on in Britain. So look, that was 7 or 8 years ago, David. Where are we, and does it still hold up?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's a good sort of summary of the thesis through your own personal experience. I mean, a couple of things I would just add to it is that partly in response to some of the criticisms in the book, I mean, I would say both the anywhere and the somewhere worldviews are perfectly decent, at least in their mainstream form. The problem is that one of them has become over dominant in our political system. It sort of unbalanced the boat. And you've had Brexit and Trump, and you've had various sort of pushbacks against it, rather kind of incoherent, perhaps you might say, pushbacks against it. And the other thing I would say is that not only are both of these worldviews perfectly decent, but they're also quite complex. I mean, the anywhere somewhere thing caught the term sort of caught the political imagination, and it kind of went into the political vocabulary to some extent. But there are, if you read the book, you'll see there are many different kinds of anywheres. There are many different kinds of somewheres. There's a big in-betweener group, about 25% of the population. The anywheres about 25%, 1/3 of the population. Somewheres are a bigger but less powerful group politically, culturally, economically. So yeah, with those sort of small additions, as it were, to your description, I guess I kind of regret the extent to. I mean, I was sort of hoping that the political upheavals, such as Brexit and Trump, which I think are partly sort of expressions of the value divides that I was describing in the book, the the priorities of the highly educated, openness, autonomy, comfortable with change, as you were saying, and the very different priorities of many of the less well-educated, more people who value stability and familiarity more, who are more connected to place and group, who are therefore more discomforted by rapid social change. And as I say, it had that expression in the Brexit vote, amongst other things. I guess I had hoped for a higher degree of regret, or at least a sort of a sense of a greater understanding on the part of the anywheres, the kind of liberal graduate class, of the problems associated with their over-domination of the political and cultural landscape. And that, with some notable exceptions, that hasn't really happened. On the other hand, you could say that that something like the Brexit vote has sort of shifted the balance. I mean, the anywheres never exactly gave up control of the steering wheel. We ended up having this partly because the vote was very close. A majority of people in Parliament, including in the Conservative Party, people often forget this, but I think it was sort of 60% plus of Tory MPs also voted Remain. And as well, obviously the whole of the civil service establishment and the cultural establishment more generally was deeply shocked and opposed to Brexit. So we didn't cover ourselves in glory, I think, as a country or a political class. It took 3 years to find a way through. But I think you could say that, although almost by definition anyways, always sort of retain control of the steering wheel, there has been a recognition in some aspects of our politics. For example, levelling up. I mean, you would never have expected, if it hadn't been for Brexit, you would not have got a Conservative Party really thinking hard and actually quite creatively, I think. I think the Andy Haldane, Michael Gove paper on levelling up is really quite an impressive piece of work, going beyond the sort of traditional just pump more money into the post-industrial areas. It's obviously been downgraded, at least the phrase levelling up has certainly been downgraded since Sunak took over. But that did represent, as it were, a kind of, somewhere priorities emerging into the mainstream. And actually, I heard John Cruddas, the Labour MP, talking the other day and saying how both the previous sort of iterations of the Labour Party under Blair, Brown, and then Corbyn, both kind of located their sort of core support among graduates, different kinds of graduates, perhaps for both groups, perhaps in a way more successful, perhaps Russell Group university graduates for the Blair, Brown, and maybe more disaffected, the kind of graduates who feel that all their hard work of getting to university and staying the course, and then they leave and they find they're not in graduate employment. They're in some 22 grand a year clerical job. That might be more the base of the sort of Corbynista, Bernie Sanders type revolt of the semi-educated. But actually, in the case of Starmer, he's making a real attempt to sort of reposition the Labour Party, among the kind of non-graduate, working and lower middle class of this country. I think but broadly speaking, I think perhaps a sense of disappointment that a sense of disappointment that the anywheres have sort of failed to kind of acknowledge their power more. And I mean, just to finish on this point, I mean, I think that there are a lot of debates these days about sort of the demise of democracy, and a lot of it is really just an expression of sort of anywhere catastrophism, still sort of in the kind of shock after waves of Brexit and Trump won anyway. But actually, there is a kind of an alternative anxiety about, if not the death of democracy, then the sort of constraining of it, coming mainly from the political right, not so much the liberal and liberal left fear of a kind of Orbanism and the bending of the rules by somebody like Trump so they can stay in power forever. But the anxiety expressed by people on parts of the centre and the right is more to do with the removal from democratic debate and conflict of so many important subjects. We saw, I mean, it was rather an extreme case, but we saw the other day that the European Court of Human Rights deciding what Switzerland's net zero policy should be after the successful action by a group of Swiss women. I mean, this kind of brings up the theory of the two constitutions. I don't know. Do you know the work of Christopher Caldwell, the conservative American journalist?
I do, but only because I've read his reflections on the revolution in Europe, which was talking about mass immigration, actually.
Right. Well, he wrote a book, I think, after that one called The Age of Entitlement, in which he talks about the sort of theory of the two constitutions. I mean, it's a very simple idea, but I think a powerful one, in which we have one constitution which is sort of the basics of democracy, voting in elections from the president to the local dog catcher, and all the things that make that system work, the rule of law and so on. But you then have a second constitution, which is the civil service, the media, the judiciary, and the sort of the cultural world, and that tends to be, the second constitution tends to be dominated by the left, or certainly people one might call liberal, the liberal left. The first constitution, the right, certainly in this country, the right has dominated the first constitution since the Second World War, but then finds its ability to actually change things according to the priorities that have got it elected, stymied by the domination of the second constitution. You can see that in something like our inability to stop thousands of people a year coming over the channel in small boats.
Yeah, well, let's linger on that, actually, because I think that is a perfect example of an anywhere policy. Is you talked about anywheres, you define them as people who are comfortable with more rapid social change, don't necessarily connect themselves to a rooted local, national culture, and see themselves as free and easy across the world. And so the idea of creating an immigration policy which effectively opens your border up, we've seen in the United Kingdom 650 to 700,000 net per year the last couple of years, but really it's 1.2 million new people and we lose 500,000 elsewhere. And the US has seen millions coming across its southern border. And so when you find people within that second constitution, the media and academia, and lots of people making noises around democracy being in danger because they sense a shift to the right, which is ultimately, from most people's reading, down to the fact that people are disillusioned with the notion that they can't actually make any change to things that matter to them and which they're actually impacted by with regards to access to jobs and services, changing culture. And it's that lockdown of all of the decision-making activities by the anywhere folks. And often it can be placed upon economic grounds. So you're not allowed to talk about culture that is seen as to be something that is an unsanitary thing to talk about, I would say, and something which has stopped us from having open policy debates about what kind of a controls you would want on your borders. But let's linger on that, David, because I know you, in your role at Policy Exchange, you're the head of demography, immigration and integration. So you'll have a view on this. Is we've often been told that there is a GDP boost from mass immigration, that immigrants will put in more than they take out. What is that true, or is it the myth? What data do we have to suggest whether that argument holds up if we're not able to talk about culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is largely a myth. I mean, well, I mean, just to pull the camera back a bit, I mean, I do think you're right that mass immigration, essentially without consent, is a massive political fact that kind of underlies a lot of political conflict. I think you could even, I mean, because the speed of change is just quite phenomenal. I mean, it's really greater than the United States at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. I was reflecting on this recently in the piece I wrote for the Saturday Times. I did the Saturday Times essay reflecting on the essay I'd written in 2004, 20 years ago, called Too Diverse? At that time, the non-white British, so the properly described ethnic minority population, which would include white ethnic minorities, people from Poland or Romania or whatever. The non-white British population of the UK in 2004 was about when there was already obviously a lot of anxiety about scale and speed of change. We'd had huge asylum inflows connected with the Balkan wars in the Balkans. We'd had the so-called Milltown riots in 2001. But the ethnic minority population of the UK then was about 10%. It is now 26%. Just in extraordinary change in 20 years. And you could say much of that has been absorbed perfectly happily. You've had a lot of positive changes in many ways. We now have much higher representation of ethnic minorities in the sort of higher professional class and indeed the political class. We have an ethnic minority prime minister. Substantial representation in conservative cabinets in recent years, and for many parts of the country, and for many, particularly the more successful ethnic minority groups, and British Indians, for example, you've had broadly a positive story. People have moved out from the inner city to the suburbs. Many of the kind of flashpoints tend to focus on the Muslim minority and Muslim sensibilities, but in many other respects, I mean, there's a high degree of segregation in the school system, but somewhat less so in where people live. But there are certainly things to celebrate. I think compared to many other countries, we've by both accident and design managed to avoid some of the conflicts that you're seeing in a place like sort of Sweden. But that still has left, I think, a lot of people, not just from the white majority, a lot of ethnic minority people too, thinking that that change has been happening too rapidly. I think there are kind of two issues that I think, as it were, distinguish a sort of sensible centrist position, you might almost say, on these issues from a more liberal position which often passes itself as the acceptable majority position. I mean, one is to do with national democracy. I mean, the nation state itself, and the ability of the nation state to prioritize existing citizens over non-citizens. And this rises, this crops up quite a lot in the immigration and the refugee debate. Should people be, and indeed it was, of course, one of the reasons for the resistance to free movement. I think what caused particular dislike of free movement was not so much the numbers of people coming over, although that was obviously a factor too, the economic competition, the lack of, competition for scarce public services and so on and so forth. But it was also the fact that people could come here and be treated in almost all respects as if they were a British citizen from day one, without, as it were, having paid into the system either economically or, one might say, almost sort of culturally. Their grandfathers hadn't died in the First World War. They weren't part of the kind of national story. Of course, they can become part of it over time, and that, it's a sort of foundation stone of democracy, you might say, in its modern national form, is the prioritization of national citizens' rights over non-citizens. And that, I think, is often blurred by more liberal-minded people in the debate, who kind of want to imply, who want to quickly move to a kind of ethnic or racial element, that you're being, you're being racist in effect to decide. I mean, even though we have obviously a multi-ethnic nation, you're being racist to imply that a national citizen should take priority over a non-national, or should even have equal rights to a non-national. And the other thing is just the reason why most people. I mean, obviously there are people who think racially, and who do have a kind of a race bug about some of these changes, but they're a pretty small minority these days. I mean, I think it's something like sort of 4% of people say that you have to be white to be truly British, and the people that sort of think in those terms are mainly dying out. Nonetheless, I think a lot of people will still interpret what I think of as mainly a discomfort about loss of familiarity over rapid change, again, as a sort of racist or a nativist reaction. And I don't think that is usually the case or fair to the people that are feeling that. So that's the sort of broader context. I mean, on the economics, you're right. I think a lot of the justification, going back 20 years or so, a lot of the justification for immigration was that we kind of, we needed to be more diverse. We were too boringly homogeneous. A kind of racial justice argument, atonement for empire, that kind of thing. I don't think people really think like that any longer, that sort of immigration is some kind of moral tonic for the nation. But the kind of the political class, which has remained, very, very strongly in favor of high levels of openness, I think both for economic and cultural reasons, now does tend to justify a high level of immigration in terms of economic arguments. And I think they're on very, very weak ground, particularly since the financial crash of 2007, 2008. I mean, I think there is an argument to say that, obviously in principle, immigration can be an economic benefit. If immigration involves people who are coming here, who are bringing skills that don't exist in the country or couldn't, quite easily be made to exist through the training system. If they're bringing skills that are lacking, if they're bringing, capital, entrepreneurship, if they're, if they're coming to do highly paid jobs, and they're paying high levels of tax, putting into the system more than they take out. All of those things are clearly beneficial for the average citizen, which is obviously the view you should take when you're judging these things. Obviously, it's beneficial for the migrant coming, otherwise they wouldn't come. They have a choice that the average citizen doesn't have. But no, the economics. We did have a lot of higher paid professionals who probably contributed to the strength of both the financial services sector, obviously one of the country's sort of specialist industries, and perhaps the kind of higher professions more generally, particularly in that boom period, or what now seems like a boom period of the early mid 2000s. Immigration may have made probably not a huge positive impact, but some positive impact. I think the East European migration in general was pretty neutral, actually, because most East Europeans were not in particularly highly paid jobs, and they obviously drew on the welfare state. They may not have been educated here, but many of them had children who were. They often qualified for tax credits and so on, or they were obviously using the health system and other parts of the welfare state. So I think the East European story was a sort of a break-even one. It's true they did often people from poorer countries, often there's a selection process in who comes here from poorer countries, and it tends to be the kind of the more get up and go, more ambitious people, and often they have a strong work ethic, stronger average work ethic possibly than the average British person. So you can see why employers like them. But I mean, the economic argument for migration is essentially one of holding down wages. I mean, the Treasury used to be pretty open about that. It's restraining wage inflation. If you have access to a bigger market, it goes back to Karl Marx talking about the reserve army of labour in Ireland. There was that was, and I think there's been a certain hypocrisy on the part of the economic establishment, kind of know perfectly well that to the extent that a high level of immigration is an economic boost, it is because it is disadvantaging the existing workforce, and holding down wages and increasing profits, which then lead to kind of higher level of investment. You get into that sort of a virtuous circle, but it does require the holding down of wages.
Yeah, that economic impact it has on existing workforce, citizens, residents of a country. I saw another graph, or another data set, shall I say, depicted in a graph which showed the rate of internal migration tracked against the rate of incoming or immigration. And what's pretty remarkable is the Blair years hit, and as the numbers start increasing with the numbers of people that are coming into the country, the number of people moving internally start to drop. And in the last 10 years or so, where it's really shot through, and obviously the last 5 years in particular, hardly anyone is now moving internally. And so clearly Britain has a history of, since the Second World War, of we've lost industry to globalization. We are now focused on the Southeast. Lots of people have been tempted to move to the Southeast in the past, but increasingly people are not doing so, even if it is the economic engine, because the housing supply is so low and it's prohibitively expensive. It's very competitive for jobs. And effectively, people would argue, looking at those graphs, that there's a bit of queue jumping going on here to get to the prime real estate, the prime jobs. And so all of this and what it does to social cohesion, when people feel like, despite what they're being told about GDP being a good thing, is it still cutting them off from somehow moving around if they should so wish. So where we go, I don't know. But the other thing, which I think has been a big driver of immigration of late, is education. And as you know very well, is mass education is something that we have pursued as a policy goal since Blair's accession to Labour leadership, and then his premiership of the country, the key policy tenet of education, education, education. Let's get 50% of our kids going to university. It was around 15% at the time. And there's a whole bunch of effects that I had, right? I felt it as someone who watched all my friends go off, and I didn't go to university and suddenly felt very, very inadequate. And then actually, similar to what you were saying, is many of them came out without the panacea having been reached. And they were like, oh, you probably did a good thing not going to university, but it didn't make me feel any less inadequate. So there was that angle, but also having effectively pursued this policy goal of molding people in the anywhere mold, the liberal metropolitan view. Let's get everyone to be global citizens because, we're global Britain, we're cool Britannia, we're compassionate. We kind of carried that on. Is we also wanted to invite lots of people in to our new university economic model, which costs an awful lot of money if you're an international student. And so all of those rising economically developed areas like China, India, and obviously other places like the US and more distant lands are paying an awful lot of money to get here to be able to say, I've been to a United Kingdom university. But there's been some pretty spurious things being found in that recently, which is despite paying 2 to 3 times the amount of a home nation student, there are much lower entry grades to get in. And so it feels like British or British residents, British citizens, those currently here are being pushed out in another way, which is I have to get into this university, I need 3 A's, 3 B's, but my contemporary from China needs 3 D's, 3 E's. And so the whole model seems to be built on sand. And then you have people, there have been various reports of late that people are just getting access to these courses. They've got no intention of enrolling. They just arrive, they get given a visa, which is pretty open-ended, and then they just disappear off into the gig economy. And so all of these things which are set up with this idea of bringing prosperity to the country I think is, whether people know it or not, it's stoking resentment because they feel like the opportunity is taken away from them. It's a back door for people to come and get into the country without having made those contributions in other ways. And it's another example of anywhere policy being very far removed from somewheres.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, in both the case of mass immigration and mass higher education, obviously, both of these things can be beneficial when properly controlled and regulated. But in both cases, I think we've obviously overshot what is in the interests of the average citizen, and I haven't seen enough kind of rethinking. I mean, there clearly are people in the political class who are rethinking their assumptions about both of these, but both of these sort of overshoots. I mean, I think just to go back, I think you're absolutely right about to go back briefly to the immigration one. I think you might even argue that one of the reasons for the very close vote in the Scottish independence referendum was a product of less mixing between Scots and English people in the last 20 years or so, partly because large-scale immigration has meant there are kind of fewer jobs for a young Scot who thinks, oh, well, go down and work in London for 2 or 3 years and then come home.
Interesting.
With normally, one would expect normally quite a few English friends and those kind of personal connections.
Sassenach aren't as bad as I thought they were.
Yeah. And I mean, just again briefly on the, I mean, as you probably know, just over half of UK citizens already take out more from the system than they pay in terms of sort of tax and taking out benefits, tax and national insurance and the benefits that people get. As I was saying earlier, East Europeans probably just about break even, but the big surge in legal migration we've had in the last 2 or 3 years has been mainly non-Europeans who are much more likely to draw on the system than to draw more out of the system than they're putting in. So the economic argument is getting even weaker. And if you look at skill shortages, for example, I mean, we have, one of the arguments made by employers for bringing people in is that we don't have the skills. Of course, one of the reasons we don't have the skills is the employers aren't investing in training. But even there, we have, I think when, large-scale immigration of the first part of this century, I think the proportion of job vacancies that were skill shortage driven was like 15%. 25 years later, very high levels of immigration, and the number of skill shortage jobs is like 32% or something. So it's not helping in that respect either. But on the university point, yes, I mean, this is one of my absolute classic cases, as it were, classic examples, classic cases for the sort of case for the prosecution against the anywhere class was Tony Blair's famous 1999 speech saying 50% of school leavers should go to university. And I think, that speech could only have been made by a politician who was surrounded only by people, who had been to probably quite elite universities and just had not given a second thought to the fact of how this would be received and felt by somebody who was not heading towards university. I mean, I call it the 50% problem, that when 15% of your classmates or the people you know in your town go to university and you don't, well, it's going to have no skin off your nose. You go and work in a local office or factory and life goes on. The sort of clever kids go off and get sort of funneled off into more kind of academic, higher cognitive related professional work. That sort of is fine. But when 50% go and you don't, it's a completely different psychological ballgame. Perhaps partly ameliorated by the fact that many of the people that do go and end up feeling pissed off that they have gone. But you end up then with two groups of discontented people, the 50% who don't go at all, who feel like second-class citizens, and then the probably reasonable proportion of the people who do go who aren't getting the high-status professional jobs that they thought that they had been promised. And that's because those higher status professional jobs are simply not expanding at the same rate as we're producing graduates. Many of them with not particularly useful generalist academic skills that employers are not interested in. Meanwhile, of course, as we all know, the higher technical manual skills are utterly lacking. We struggle to employ the kind of technicians that keep so much of our society ticking over. We just made a big mistake. We have a huge mismatch. And I mean, again, there are signs. Obviously, I mean, when it comes to the immigration story, a lot of this was overseen by a party that sort of in principle and traditionally has been more skeptical of large-scale immigration than the party of the left. And so some of it was kind of by accident. I mean, there seem to be so many biases in the system. I mean, the numbers always turn out to be kind of higher than people expected. We had the famous example of, 13,000 East Europeans are going to come every year, and it turned out to be 1.5 million came in the next 3 or 4 years. We then discover, when we do finally end that system, we find we expect there to be 3.5 million people from the EU living here, and we discover that there are almost 6 million. I mean, and then the Tories create this sort of post-Brexit immigration system, without giving enough thought to leaving various loopholes. We've had sort of sudden hundreds of thousands of both students and workers bringing independence. Anyway, I mean, there is an element of a sort of blip, a relatively temporary blip about some of the huge numbers in 2022 and when it was like 700, net migration of more than 700,000. 2023 will be probably somewhere similar to that. The numbers will come in. So some of that was a sort of post-Brexit thing, perhaps in the student numbers. We had the Ukraine and the Hong Kong factors. Both of them will be lower in the years to come. Labour will actually benefit, I think, from quite sharply falling immigration, partly due to the fact that some of these loopholes have been closed. They will no doubt claim credit for it, even though they won't be responsible for it. The
immigration point. I don't particularly know what's going on with either of the parties, but the fact that since it shot up to 750,000 is you have senior Conservatives saying, what we're going to do is we're going to bring this down to 400,000 with almost no sense of shame that people were uncomfortable when it was half that figure. And even when they were elected to office in 2010, it was about getting it down into the tens of thousands. So still quite a remarkable uptick.
If it was highly productive immigration, then people would be much less unhappy about it. But I mean, I think people do often, understand what is going on much, much better than they're assumed to. And people can see that a lot of the immigration is pretty unproductive.
Yeah.
So we have an unproductive, or at least a substantial kind of unproductive drag, you might say, on the higher education system, and a substantial unproductive drag on the immigration system. These two things that were meant to be kind of powering growth are clearly not doing so. Both of them have been expanding exponentially almost in recent years, and yet we've been living through this period since 2008 of very, very slow growth and very low productivity. I mean, the case is made pretty clearly.
Well, and let's think about social cohesion for a moment. And we've touched on the welfare state, the conditions in which it was built post-war. Very different social contract. It's obviously grown exponentially since then. We've touched a little bit on how immigrants, particularly those who will get up and go to a new country, clearly there's something about them that makes them a bit of a go-getter. But I do wonder whether Britain's found itself in a bit of a pincer movement where it's created, and I think these are words used by others, this kind of amniotic sac of a welfare state where you're so reliant upon the state for so many different things. And any economist, and I know they don't see everything clearly, but they'll talk about how incentives matter. And if you, over time, in a population, disincentivize things like working or take away just responsibility by centralizing it, I can see how a population might have less incentive to go working. But then on top of that, you have to ask yourself the social cohesion question, which is, Britain can't surely set itself up for its point of pride being having a welfare state that isn't just for the nation, but now it's an international welfare state. I think many of those 700,000 that came over, I think it was 15% are going into the workforce from the pie chart I saw from an ONS, Office of National Statistics, and a huge number aren't. And we don't know how much of them are going onto the welfare state, but enough that is going to increase the tax burden. And there are lots of these Centre for Migration Studies think tanks who are going out going, right, what's the fiscal drag? What's being taken out of the system? And in an age where Britain feels pretty bust, economically, I don't know how this can be sold. And so whenever, I don't know when a party will get to grip with this issue once it moves past, Eric Kaufman believes all of the taboos that have been built around talking about these issues that you've touched on, like accusing people of being racist for wanting to talk about immigration policy, that we won't ever make any progress on it and be able to come to something which people will accept in the country of all stripes and none. until we can get past that
Yeah.
taboo. And I don't know which party's going to come and grasp the nettle there, but surely we can't just keep going on thinking, oh, well, even if we can get it down to 400,000 a year, that's great. We'll keep growing the welfare state. We'll keep increasing the tax burden. We won't skill up those people that are already in the country, because that's not going to lead to anything happy, particularly with the disaffected graduate class that keeps growing in the mix, that with their activist ways.
Yeah. And I think it was Andy Haldane, the guy that used to be at the Bank of England, now at the RSA. Quite a sort of centre-left figure in some ways. So I think I'd think of him as a kind of social democrat. He wrote something the other day I saw saying that we're in this kind of doom loop. He likes doom loops of kind of low growth and more safety nets. We need a kind of we need to sort of clean out the tubes, as it were, clean out the kind of wiring of our society. And Margaret Thatcher is credited with having done that economically, whatever it was, 40 or 50 years ago. And I think to some extent she did. We don't. That also created much conflict and mass unemployment, and a kind of tilt towards making the rich and the better off even richer, and so on. So we don't necessarily want to do it in that way, but some almost a kind of sort of social democratic version of Thatcherism is perhaps what. So that we can build the houses where people want them, we can build the laboratories and the factories and get going. And as it is, we seem to have more and more safety nets being imposed on the system. I mean, whether it's business regulation, I mean, the extraordinary. You think about all the kind of data protection legislation, money laundering, kind of net zero. Particularly bigger companies, but that has an impact on smaller companies who are in their supply chains, let alone DEI. And no, all of those things may be necessary up to a point, but again, we seem to have kind of overshot in some ways. And I mean, there's a sort of sense of stagnation about the country at the moment. There's quite a sullen mood, nothing at all like 1997. We're on the verge of another big Labour victory, and it's a sort of shame in a way that often these sort of big switches in political power from one party to another lead to a sort of sense of renewal and sort of growth. And I hope that does happen, but it seems pretty unlikely at the moment. And I do wonder whether the two-party system is helping to lock in this kind of stagnation. I mean, I'm certainly converted to the idea of proportional representation. And I wonder whether we will, in one way or another, kind of somehow work around the two-party system so that we do get an expression of a wider range of views. And we do have, the somewhere voice finding expression. I mean, of course, that there was the potential for a realignment of politics, as I kind of touched on at the beginning, that the great sort of 2019 realignment that didn't happen, a kind of perhaps not quite in the way that the Republican Party in the United States has sort of become the party of the kind of angry working class, but there was certainly that possibility, with all the red wall seats falling to the Tories, the focus on levelling up. I mean, that sense that the kind of Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove sort of version of a modern, perhaps sort of social democratic Toryism, could have shifted, and made the Tory party, at least to some extent, a more somewhere party, as it were, a sort of pro-business somewhere party. Leaving the Labour Party as the sort of liberal graduate party. But anyway, that didn't happen. like I say, I mean, obviously Labour won't have any incentive to introduce proportional representation, but I think that, that maybe, if they become very unpopular very quickly, and I think that is one possibility. I think it's also possible that the economy is picking up somewhat. Immigration is going to be coming down. They are a new set of faces. I mean, I don't, and I suspect. I mean, when New Labour came to power in 1997, they had various sort of big policy shifts up their sleeve, like the independence of the Bank of England. I don't think that this Labour government is going to, but they may actually have a kind of plan for social care, for example, which has been a real political failure for the last 15 or 20 years. It will require spending a bit more money, but not a huge amount. So that it's possible that, of course, the sort of equal and opposite fear is that they won't be able to do anything very much economically for their sort of core supporters. So they'll do things more in the sort of cultural and social sphere, which will just alienate, at least half of the country. There'll be various sort of gestural, symbolic, political things. But I mean, looking more generally, I mean, what I worry about most is that for both as we do get richer, albeit quite slowly, and through technological change, we are becoming more fragmented. That's not always a bad thing. One person's fragmentation is another person's greater choice, you might say. The fact that, you and I probably spend far less time listening to media that are listened to by millions and millions of other people, and far more time listening to podcasts that are listened to by a couple of 100,000 people, perhaps. So you've got that kind of fragmentation, but then you also have, much greater value and ethnic diversity than we had even 20 or 30 years ago. That's not all a bad thing, but it means that balancing these more, balancing this, the greater individualism, the way that we sort of curate our lives in a much more individualistic way. If we still want to hold on to some notion of the common good and political action on behalf of all of us, then we need, a form of post-ethnic nationalism, post-ethnic national identity that encompasses the broad majority of people. And we need politicians who can sort of inspire us about that. Because we do have big challenges coming down the road. I mean, we're going to be a 40% ethnic minority country by probably 2045 or 2050. We're going to have, we've got, the huge challenge, potential economic challenge of climate change. We've got an aging society. We've got, and how we kind of burden share amongst ourselves. Politicians have to have the legitimacy to make big decisions about those things. And one of the sort of dismaying things about recent times, I think, is the way that, that kind of, benign, useful national identity, has the sense of it sort of withering somewhat. I mean, it may still be there, and it could, to be called upon. But I mean, that's one of the things I worry about. And maybe, I mean, and that there is a kind of elite dislike of sort of, using nationalism, national identity, and I think that. Well, there was a sort of broader elite problem of, so I actually did a point of view BBC Radio, one of those sort of 10-minute talk things a couple of years ago about this, what I call the sort of false outsider syndrome, that, that even the people, even the privileged people, even the people in the, the highly educated people in the political class, and don't really sort of think of themselves as running the country. Everybody wants to be an outsider. I remember what triggered my interest in it was actually listening to an interview with David Baddiel, the comedian. And I remember him he described himself in a Sunday Times interview as lower middle class. And I remember thinking, but David Baddiel went to Haberdasher's Ask private school, and Cambridge. His dad was an industrial chemist or something. He didn't necessarily come from a sort of hugely privileged background, but David Baddiel is not lower middle class. I mean, that kind of not wanting to sort of take responsibility for one's privilege, and perhaps just more generally not taking responsibility, not setting an example. I mean, it's a very old-fashioned, sounds like a sort of William Gladstone era idea that sort of elites should set an example, but I don't think it's such a terrible idea, really.
No, I think it's a blooming good one, to be honest, David. I think if you're in a position of responsibility, authority, you have power. I mean, clearly there are things that are going to be more conducive to an individual's benefit, a nation's benefit, a region's benefit, if you were to try to inculcate actual virtue, that idea of character development. And I suppose that's what Queen Elizabeth II represented. Many people spoke about her as she represented this kind of staid, but kind of upright, benevolent figure, but someone who believed in following through, setting an example. And that's something that was a connection to the old world, as it were, the pre whenever you want to define modernity, but pre 1960s, I guess. And we don't really see anyone aping those kind of values. I was just speaking with Professor Carl Truman, who is over in the States, but he's an Englishman. He's written a lot about the social imaginary, this idea of all the ideas and values that swirl around in a culture that become popular over time through arts and literature, and what people attach status to. And then however long the elites show that they're interested in those things and propagate it, it ends up filtering down. And in the past, there were things that were more useful to people, regardless of your social status, than perhaps now, where there's a lot more of there are no common standards. Everyone's trying to be a bit of a cool parent, as it were. And sometimes I even look at old images of the working class, for example, who are coming out of factories or they're working on railroads. And what I'm always struck by, from the elites right down to the lower ranks of society, is how well dressed everyone is. This idea of wanting to present an appearance. And
respectability, yeah,
exactly. And in the lockdown, I'm logging on to Teams calls, whether it's in a professional environment or not, or even walking around professional offices in the city of London, if I ever go down there, and people are walking around in New Balance trainers, trousers up, socks showing, and shirts open, and it's and they're actually the anywheres, the middle classes, and I find that quite interesting. Athleisure being the thing that CEOs and the like will wear, in comparison to folks who used to comport themselves in a different way. David, I know I probably only got you for a little bit longer, and I want to be able to give some time to your new book, which I think is fair.
Well, actually, there's a good link here, because actually a classic area, or where modern elites behave in one way but speak in another way, is kind of marriage and the family. I mean, I've just finished writing a book on the partly on the family. It's a little more broad than it's broader than that. It's about the undervaluing of the domestic sphere in general. I say rather grandly, it's the third in my anywhere anywhere critique. The first book was a sort of a general critique of the kind of anywhere worldview, and particularly to do with sort of openness and and migration issues and national identity issues. Where there's this big gap between kind of anywheres and somewheres, and the second was on the Head, Hand, Heart book was more about the overvaluing of just sort of one particular human aptitude, the kind of analytical intelligence, the sort of data, manipulating information and data, and the third, I think, is about the undervaluing of the domestic sphere and the family, and the kind of tension that has emerged between care and sex equality. I mean, I think we've got a kind of, to put it as neutrally as possible, we've got a sort of investment problem. How do we invest enough in having and raising babies, in looking after old people and impaired people, in the way that we say that we want, when there are fewer people to do the caring. I mean, partly for good reasons. I mean, this is an area like so many areas of political life where the sort of the positive things and negative things are all sort of tied up together. So, arguably the biggest increase in human freedom since the Second World War has been women's autonomy, women's much greater autonomy, partly inspired by second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the big legal changes, and the massive movement of women into the paid workforce out of the family. But that has left a big hole, and there's a sort of false accounting that goes on here. We see only the sort of positive benefit, both sort of culturally and economically, of the movement of women into the paid economy, and we do not see the gap that has been left behind. We've ended up with much smaller and I think weaker families, and that actually means a much bigger state. It's not only the aging society that is piling more and more responsibility and cost onto the state and therefore the taxpayer. We've got the mental fragility epidemic particularly amongst young people, which I think has, notwithstanding, although I think Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge and all of the argument about social media and smartphones and so on is clearly a factor. But I think there's a bigger background factor, which is the fact that in the UK today, nearly 50% of kids born this century are not living with both of their biological parents when they do their GCSEs when they're about 16. I mean, that is a huge change. I mean, that number was less than half that 20, 30 years ago.
And what are the social outcomes for kids who grow up?
Well, massively worse for people from either single parent homes, where it's kind of obvious in a way. Obviously, you have less resources, both kind of emotional and financial, to go around if you only have one parent. But those one-parent families often started off as two-parent families. I mean, the great sort of turmoil of changing faces and places, particularly when children are very young. I mean, John Bowlby's attachment theory that is sort of premised on the idea that at least in the first sort of 2 or 3 years of life, infants need a very high degree of stability and connection, with a primary carer. It doesn't always have to be the mother, although it generally tends to be. It can, and the mother obviously can be supported by other sort of secondary primary carers, if you like. But none of that work has ever really been disproved. Indeed, it fed into quite a lot of British public policy. For example, the closure of lots of children's homes, the preference for fostering over putting children in children's homes and so on. The way that private boarding schools sort of fell out of fashion. And yet we are about to spend, this government, a Conservative government, the party of the family supposedly, is about to spend, or is in the process of spending £4 billion extra a year on childcare. Childcare that would encompass infants as young as 9 months, which will also mainly benefit. I mean, clearly we do need a decent childcare system. No one is arguing with that. And despite the fact that we spend a very large amount of money on it, it's still, because of the way that it was originally set up, highly over-regulated in some ways. The kind of carer to child ratios are much higher in certain areas, in certain respects, than in much of the rest of the rich world. So it's too expensive for parents. Nonetheless, investing a huge amount of taxpayers' money in childcare for really, really small infants, the infants who really are in need of a secure relationship with a primary carer, will mainly benefit couples, both of whom are working full time. The number of people that think this is a good way of raising children below school age is like 9%, in British social attitude surveys. This is one of the areas where there's the biggest disconnect between sort of elite opinion or political class opinion and majority opinion. And partly because of the way that political class opinion has evolved, we really don't talk very much about the huge impact of smaller and weaker families on so many areas. I mean, so many social problems have a huge family dimension, whether it's sort of criminal justice, whether it's housing, you name it, education. Anyway, I'm trying to sort of pull some of these things together in this book. And like I say, I'm going to talk about how weaker families mean a bigger state. There's this knock-on effect, I think, it's a big background factor in the mental fragility epidemic. And of course, we had the falling birth rate. It's another huge factor, partly created by the greater insecurity of modern relationships, not to mention obviously things like housing and of course this is a very international phenomenon, the falling birth rate. But I think it's a rich country phenomenon where we put a kind of short-term idea of freedom ahead of the things that really do give us long-term sort of happiness and satisfaction in life. And I think that it's very difficult to deal with forces that are kind of, as it were, satisfying people in the kind of immediate short term. When someone put it quite well the other day that we're pro-child but anti-natalist. That's partly to do with the kind of intensive parenting, over-intensive parenting in some ways. Jonathan Haidt talks about how that we kind of over-regulate children in the real world and we under-regulate children in online. I think he has definitely captured something there. But the idea that life as a childless individual has, even somebody on, say, of average wealth, on average earnings, the quality of life for the average person in a rich country has increased enormously, I think, in the last 30 or 40 years. You just sort of think of, things like smartphone, our connectivity, the kind of access that you have to, the cheap travel, the, Netflix. The kind of entertainment possibilities, the sort of food, our obsession with ever more sophisticated forms of food. And there are so many more things we can do with our time. Parenting, which is a very difficult and time-consuming and boring thing, has, if anything, got harder. So, if you're only if you're only measuring, as it were, sort of short-term satisfaction, you can see why birth rates have tumbled and why they're going to go on tumbling. And it probably does require, there are lots of things the government can do. I mean, we have just talking about it as a problem, which of course it is. I mean, it's a huge economic problem, because as all these sort of dependency ratios start to shift against us, more and more retired people per worker, and that means more and more taxes on the smaller and smaller number of people who are doing productive work. And as we've just been talking about, immigration is not solving the problem. If anything, it's making it worse. A small amount of the right kind of, what Neil O'Brien talks about the sort of grammar school type immigration, where you're highly selective, might help. But to compensate for we've had a below replacement birth rate for more than 50 years now. It's likely to be heading down further. We're below 1.5, 2.1 is replacement. To turn that round is going to be very, very difficult. And immigration, the rate of immigration you would require to keep the age structure more or less as it is now becomes absolutely enormous very quickly. So it really isn't an option. I mean, of course, we can raise the retirement age. I mean, there are things that can be done. But so, I'm sort of trying to bring all of these things. Well, and the other kind of factor, which isn't so directly to do with the family, but you could say it's to do with the kind of ideas of sort of care and nurture that sort of derive from the family, is the recruitment crisis in public economy care jobs, in both in elder care and in nursery care. So if you all of those four things, I think, the smaller and weaker family, the mental fragility epidemic, the falling birth rate, the recruitment crisis in care jobs, are all expressions of the undervaluing of the domestic sphere, and sort of the putting of freedom first, or a kind of shallow idea of freedom, I think. And I think we're particularly bad in this country in some ways. We do not, we have a very anti-natalist public policy. We have this welfare limit on 2 children. We don't support the family in the tax system. And there are some very simple things you could do to make it easier for families to stay together, particularly in that sort of high stress period of, when children are very young and often work responsibilities are at their most intense. And one thing that would be very popular would be to basically pay people to stay at home and look after their children at that point. Make that a respectable paid thing to do. There could be a kind of home care allowance, as some other countries already have. And actually, it wouldn't be hugely costly, because you could sort of package together quite a lot of the money that's already being spent. We spend, as I said earlier, a huge amount on childcare. Why not give that to individual families rather than having it sort of top down at the moment, paid by government through the nursery system? If you did that, and you did, and you can, if you front-ended child benefit, so that families could get 3,000 or 4,000 quid a year in child benefit, rather than the kind of bit more than 1,000 quid you get at the moment, and then have it extending for less long into. You can go on getting it till a child is 16 or even 20 at the moment. You could front-end child benefit. You could give childcare direct to parents. You could introduce, this would cost a bit of money, but you could introduce a proper family tax allowance that almost all other rich countries have, but we don't. So we are particularly bad. And we're not talking about the falling birth rate as a problem in a way that quite a few other rich countries are. France has always been, certain since it got overrun in 1870 by a more populist Prussia, it's been very conscious of the necessity of keeping your birth rate up. So, Macron has been giving speeches about this recently, but and I think the economics will force us to start worrying about this much more publicly than we have been so far.
Well, I think people are worrying about it publicly. You're one of them. I'm very appreciative of that. And there are a multitude of voices coming at it from different angles. I mean, you bring your very detailed policy analysis approach to it, which is one of the ways that you can turn this ship around. There are lots of high-profile voices that, whilst our ministers aren't talking about it, I think they're going to have to soon, because, when you've got the likes of you talking about it from that angle, Louise Perry, who's giving more of a let's just love having children because we love having children, and we're taking a punt on the future. And there's even a kind of spiritual element to it. There's the guy taking the data angle, Stephen J. Shaw, with his birth gap documentaries. It's starting to raise the profile. Whether we turn it around or not, I don't know. But there's clearly multiple ways we can go from it. David, when can we expect the book, and what's it going to be titled?
Not till September, actually. So I probably shouldn't be talking about it already.
That's okay. I'm taking it as a premiere of sorts. Anything's a boost.
And I'm not quite sure about the title, but
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is, and although I sort of talk about how, it is a kind of anywhere bias. Anywhere people tend to be very public realm people, not so much domestic realm people, and that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there are all sorts of things that may help tilt the balance back to valuing the domestic sphere more. I mean, we're going to spend more time at home. We got working from home as a result of the pandemic. And the pandemic, although we kind of look back on the pandemic now as a sort of crisis period that's left these deep scars, I mean, there were actually some very positive things about it too. You went back and discovered your roots. And I think a lot of people discovered the family is alive and kicking. And actually, we all rallied round and saved Granny. Children returned home, and parents on the whole reported that they kind of enjoyed reconnecting often with their older children. So I think, and AI is presumably going to, in the medium term, sort of cut the working week. People are going to be at home more. And you are also seeing a shift. I mean, the response to quite a lot of what I've been saying, the response from the traditional sort of feminist response is, well, men have got to step up. One of the reasons we have these sort of care gaps, if you like, is that women are free not to care in the way that they never used to be. And of course, lots of women are doing care jobs, but at a sort of higher professional level. They're training as medics or nurses. And there's been so that means there are simply fewer people to do the kind of social care work that used to have a much bigger potential pool of mainly women to do. So that, the response that, well, men have got to step up. Men are stepping up, I think, more than they're generally given credit for in the domestic sphere. I mean, the sort of balance of childcare in the home, childcare and other sort of domestic labor. It's not 50-50, but it's sort of gone from sort of 70-30 to sort of 40-60, perhaps even 45-55 in the Nordic countries. What isn't happening though is men are not going into, traditionally female parts of the public care economy. Not yet, not in particularly large numbers anyway. Social care nursing is 89% female, social care is about 81% female. primary schools are about 85% female. Interestingly, the HR department is overwhelmingly female too, and social work and so on. I think we will start worrying more about the baby bust, and there will be, for the reasons I've just given, there'll be a sort of return to domesticity, and hopefully a more. I mean, because one of the things I meant to mention earlier, I mean, that when one is sort of thinking about the balance of power, if you like, between anywheres and somewheres, I mean, I was sort of describing that in a rather pessimistic way at the beginning, which I think in some ways is justified, given, as I was saying, the kind of response to Brexit and Trump being almost to kind of double down on sort of anywhere priorities rather than sort of say, oh, yes, actually democracy does require, at the very least, kind of losers' consent. And you're not going to get losers' consent if you are not taking their interests into account, at least to some extent. But of course, the other thing that, although anywheres retain, and kind of almost by definition always will retain, control over the sort of the national political steering wheel, they have lost control over the means of communication, for good and ill. And that maybe that will help to sort of rebalance things in some ways. When my worry is, just perhaps as a sort of final point, my worry is on although I think a lot of the argument about, is democracy dying is catastrophism, often driven from the kind of liberal left, post-Brexit liberal left catastrophism. And as we were arguing earlier, I think there's just as, if not a better argument to say that democracy is being diluted through the kind of liberal left initiative of taking too much out of the democratic political sphere and into the sort of the zone of kind of experts and judiciary and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, I do think there is a real danger that politics will, I mean, this is a sort of boring cliche in a way, that politics will become more polarized, but it will become more polarized partly because the kind of cultural issues that we've been mainly talking about are much harder to compromise on than socioeconomic issues. The kind of, if for the sake of argument, one assumes that sort of, up until the kind of 1990s, 2000s even, most of post-war politics was sort of primarily socioeconomic, based on, the categories of social class and state and the market and higher or lower public spending and taxes and, how much redistribution and so on. I mean, all those things are still there, obviously, and may even have made a bit of a comeback in recent times, but we have a much bigger role for cultural issues on which it's much harder to compromise. Socioeconomic issues sort of lend themselves to compromise in a way that cultural issues don't. And when you add to that the sort of social media algorithm problem, the confirmation bias, the kind of stereotyping and ridiculing of views that you disagree with, then, and if you add to that also the fact that we may be in for very long periods of kind of low to non-existent growth. I mean, the whole history of democracy has been pretty much one of, with occasional blips, has been one of increasing standards of living. So, yeah, I mean, I think there are, without being catastrophist, I think there are reasons for worrying somewhat about the future of democracy, particularly given to go right back to the beginning of our conversation an hour or so ago, that the the kind of lack of sort of self-awareness, the lack of empathy of the culturally dominant groups in our society.
Yeah. Democracy means you have to accept dissent, and unfortunately, we're in an era where the culturally generally brook no dissent. So let's live in hope wherever that resides. We're going to cling on to it, and I hope you keep fighting the good fight with what you're doing. And it seems that there are various conversations going on across all of these things we've spoken about in at least the new media landscape, which reaches probably a larger number of people than the mainstream media these days in many respects. So let's see where we go. David, apart from the book that's coming out later in the year, is there anywhere that you can be found in the digital ether that people can follow your work on?
I don't have a Substack. I don't have a website. I do have I'm on Twitter, and I kind of write books and do journalism. I've often wondered whether I should have a website or perhaps do a Substack, but not yet. Okay.
We'll watch this space. Well, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and getting into all those subjects in such detail. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I wish you all the best with the book launch.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John.
With all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.